$300,000 is one of the strangest numbers in personal finance. Because below that number, you are still building wealth primarily with your own labor. Above that number, if the money is sitting in a low-cost S&P 500 index fund, something changes. At the market's long-run historical average return of about 10% a year, $300,000 grows to roughly $2 million in 20 years without a single additional contribution. No stock picking. No market timing. No guru. No hot tips. No complex strategy. Just time, compounding, and the discipline to leave it alone. And that last part is the hard part. Because when somebody spends 10 or 15 years grinding their way to $300,000, inaction starts to feel irresponsible. You get to that number and suddenly doing nothing feels lazy. It feels negligent. It feels like you should optimize, improve, upgrade, get more sophisticated. But for most people, that urge to do something is the exact thing that will cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is the hidden truth. The journey from $300,000 to $2 million is usually not about finding better investments. It's about not sabotaging the compounding machine you already built. And that's why $300,000 matters. Because it's not just a nice round number. For most savers, it's the point where wealth building goes through a phase shift. Below that level, your savings rate is doing most of the work. Above that level, your portfolio starts doing work that used to be your job. At a 10% annual return, a $300,000 portfolio produces about $30,000 in market gains in year one. That matters because for a lot of disciplined middle and upper middle income households, $15,000 to $35,000 per year is about the realistic range of what they can consistently invest after taxes, housing, food, family, and life. In other words, once you hit $300,000, your portfolio may be contributing as much to your wealth each year as you are. That is a completely different game. Below critical mass, you're pushing the machine. Above critical mass, the machine starts pushing itself. In nuclear physics, there is a concept called critical mass. Below critical mass, the reaction depends on outside input. At critical mass, the reaction becomes self-sustaining. That is the best way to think about $300,000 in a broad, low-cost index fund. Below that number, your hustle drives the system. Above that number, compounding begins to sustain itself. So the job changes. Your job is no longer to find a better engine. Your job is to avoid breaking the one that is already running. That leads to the 5 rules almost everyone needs once they cross this threshold. Rule 1. Stop trying to outsmart the engine. Most people think the next stage of wealth building requires more complexity, a better strategy, a better manager, a better set of tactical decisions. Usually it doesn't. Usually it requires fewer decisions. The S&P 500's average annual return has been about 10% since 1957, and Fidelity notes that the past 40 years averaged 11.5% as of the end of 2025 Fidelity. That doesn't mean future returns are guaranteed. It does mean that history has rewarded long-term ownership of productive businesses far more reliably than most attempts to outtrade them. Once you already own the engine, your edge is no longer brilliance. Your edge is restraint. Rule 2. Kill fee drag before it kills compounding. This is the least exciting rule. It is also one of the most financially important. Imagine 2 people start with the same $300,000. One compounds at 10% for 30 years. The other compounds at 9% because a 1% annual fee gets skimmed off the top. At 10%, $300,000 becomes about $5.23 million. At 9%, it becomes about $3.98 million. That 1% difference costs about $1.25 million over 30 years. Not because the fee itself is massive in year one. In year one, 1% on $300,000 is only $3,000. The problem is that every dollar removed in fees is a dollar that never compounds again. Fees don't just subtract. They compound against you. And the painful part is that higher fees do not reliably buy better results. The latest SPIVA U.S. year-end 2025 report found that 79% of active U.S. large-cap funds underperformed the S&P 500 S&P Dow Jones indices. Morningstar's work is equally brutal. Over the decade through 2025, only 21% of active funds survived and beat their average indexed peer. And in 2025 alone, only 38% survived and outperformed their average passive peer Morningstar. So if someone is charging you active fees to deliver passive-like implementation, you are often paying more for worse odds. A low-cost index fund example makes the contrast obvious. Vanguard's VO tracks the S&P 500 and carries a 0.03% expense ratio. Vanguard. On $300,000, that is about $90 a year. Not $3,000. Not $5,000. About $90. That is the kind of cost structure compounding likes. Rule 3. Asset allocation matters, but asset location matters too. This is one of the most ignored wealth accelerators in personal finance because it sounds technical, but the idea is simple. Asset allocation is what you own. Asset location is where you own it. And once your money is spread across a 401k, an IRA, a Roth IRA, an HSA, and a taxable brokerage account, where can materially affect how much you keep. Here is the broad principle. Put your highest growth assets in the most tax-protected space. Put your tax-inefficient assets in tax-deferred space. Keep your most tax-efficient assets in taxable accounts. Why? Because a Roth IRA is the most valuable real estate in your financial life. Growth inside a Roth can become permanently tax-free. That makes it the ideal place for long-term equity compounding. Traditional 401ks and traditional IRAs are useful places for assets that throw off taxable income, like bond funds, because the tax hit is deferred. And taxable brokerage accounts tend to work best with tax-efficient, low-turnover index funds. Most investors mirror the same mix everywhere because it feels neat and symmetrical. But neat is not the same as optimal. Vanguard's research suggests asset location can add up to about 0.3% annually in after-tax return under the right conditions, especially when an investor has both taxable and tax-advantaged accounts, balanced asset mixes, and enough time for the benefit to compound. Vanguard Corporate. A few tenths of a percent may not sound exciting. Over 15 or 20 years, it can turn into tens of thousands of dollars. Not because you found a better investment. Because you stopped letting taxes leak out of the wrong bucket. Rule 4. Use every tax shelter the law gives you. A surprising number of people cross $300,000 and still leave tax-advantaged space unused every year. That is like building a compounding machine and then leaving part of the fuel on the floor. For 2026, the IRS says the 401k contribution limit is $24,500. The IRA limit is $7,500. And workers ages 60 to 63 can make a higher 401k catch-up that brings the total to $35,750 IRS. And then there is the HSA. If you qualify for one, it is one of the most powerful accounts in the tax code. For 2026, the HSA limit is $4,400 for self-only coverage and $8,750 for family coverage IRS. The HSA is special because it offers a rare triple advantage. You may get a tax deduction going in, tax-free growth while invested, and tax-free withdrawals for qualified medical expenses. That is not just another account. That is an unusually favorable compounding environment. If you are sending money to a taxable account before fully using the best tax shelters available to you, you are not being flexible. You are volunteering for more tax drag than necessary. Rule 5. When the market panics, your job is to stay boring. This is the rule that determines whether the whole system works. Because most investors do not fail from lack of information. They fail from interruption. They stay invested on the way up. They panic on the way down. And the compounding engine gets unplugged right when it is supposed to keep running. That is what happened in 2022. The market dropped sharply. A lot of people convinced themselves they were being prudent by moving to cash. But the years after major drawdowns are often exactly where the damage of panic selling shows up. If two investors start with the same portfolio and one exits after a decline while the other stays invested, The long-term gap is not just the rebound they missed. It is the compounding on the rebound they missed. That is the part people underestimate. Missing one recovery year hurts. Missing the compounding on that recovery hurts for a decade. Think of it this way. If you owned a productive piece of farmland and a drought temporarily reduced its appraised value, would that automatically make the land a bad asset? No. The short-term price changed. The long-term productive capacity did not vanish overnight. That is how broad equity ownership works in a diversified index fund. A falling quote is not automatically a broken asset. Sometimes it is just volatility doing what volatility does. And if your horizon is 15, 20, or 30 years, the market does not need your emotional reaction. It needs your patience. This is where the acceleration really happens. Now put the whole system together. Suppose you have $300,000 invested in a low-cost index structure. If you contribute nothing else and earn 10% annually, you reach roughly $2 million in about 20 years. But if you keep feeding the system, say you add $30,000 per year, your timeline shortens dramatically. Now you are not just letting the reactor run. You are feeding more fuel into a reaction that is already self-sustaining. And that is when things get interesting. Because at $300,000 earning 10%, the portfolio is producing about $30,000 of growth in year one. If you also contribute another $30,000, then $60,000 is effectively going to work that year. That doesn't mean returns are smooth or guaranteed. It means the machine is now powerful enough that every dollar you add lands inside a compounding system that is already alive. And that changes the value of your choices. At this stage, lifestyle inflation becomes extremely expensive. Not morally wrong. Mathematically expensive. Every $1,000 that could have stayed invested for 20 years at 10% is not just $1,000 spent. It is roughly $6,700 of future value you gave up. That is why people who reach $300,000 and suddenly start upgrading everything often slow down the very process that was about to become extraordinary. The irony is brutal. They finally reach the point where compounding can do the heavy lifting, and that is exactly when many of them reduce the amount of fuel going into the machine. A real-world example. Imagine someone named Sarah. She is 42, earns a solid income, has $300,000 spread across a rollover IRA, a current 401k, and a taxable brokerage account. She contributes just enough to get the employer match. She has an HSA-eligible health plan, but never opened an HSA. Her taxable account holds an actively managed fund with a high expense ratio and taxable distributions. Nothing about that setup sounds catastrophic, but it is inefficient. Now imagine she makes 4 changes in one afternoon. She swaps the expensive taxable fund for a low-cost total market index fund. She maxes the 401k. She opens and funds the HSA. She uses the Roth IRA for long-term equity growth. Same income, same market, same starting balance. But now the machine is cleaner, cheaper, and more tax efficient. That kind of change does not make her richer overnight. It makes the next 10 to 20 years work harder on her behalf. And that is the entire point. At this level, wealth is no longer mostly about hustle. It is about system design. The biggest misunderstanding at $300,000. Most people think hitting $300,000 means they should become more active. The opposite is closer to the truth. This is the point where good investing often starts to look boring. Low fees, broad diversification, tax efficiency, maximum sheltering, and the discipline to stay put when everyone else starts performing panic in public. That is not laziness. That is operational maturity. Because once the engine is working, unnecessary intervention is not sophistication. It is interference. So what should you actually do this week? Start with 3 things. First, calculate your true all-in investment cost. Add advisory fees, fund expense ratios, and any hidden drag from expensive products. If the total is high, understand exactly what you are paying for. Second, look at where your assets are sitting. Not just what you own, but where you own it. Ask whether your highest growth assets are in your most tax-protected accounts. Third, measure how much tax-advantaged room you left and used last year. That number tells you exactly how much compounding fuel you left outside the machine. These are not glamorous changes. They're better than glamorous changes. They are effective changes. Final thought. Reaching $300,000 is not the finish line. It is the point where wealth starts behaving differently. It is where the years of discipline begin to convert into self-sustaining momentum. Below that level, you carry the system. Above that level, the system starts carrying you. And if you understand that, the goal is no longer to constantly improve the portfolio. The goal is to stop interrupting the compounding. You already built the engine. You already did the hard part. Now the challenge is simpler and psychologically much harder. Leave it alone long enough to do what it was built to do.